The Israel Defense Force has gone into Gaza in a way which is quite different from what was initially imagined after the 7th of October. They thought that it'd be a big blitzkrieg. Instead, they've gone in some areas in a slow and deliberate fashion. Why do you think they've chosen to do what they have? And how do you see this ground offensive pan out from what we've seen so far?
I think you have to give President Biden a lot of credit for the way he has handled this. If you remember when it all began with the Hamas terror attack, President Biden was very strongly behind Israel, visited Israel, gained enormous credibility, I think, not just from the Israeli government, but from the Israeli people. That then allowed him to make his main pitch, which, if you remember, was slow down, think this through, ask yourself why and what you are doing, make sure that you have a plan for what happens as it goes on, and most importantly, he said, don't act in the heat of the moment. We did that after 9/11. We made mistakes. That was a very rare thing for an American president to say. And I think it allowed the whole Israeli system, because Biden is right now wildly popular in Israel, it allowed the whole Israeli system to almost sort of calm down for a minute. It almost gave them permission to think things through. And look, they're very smart people. And they began to realize, look, what do we gain by a massive ground assault? You're going to kill thousands and thousands of people. You're going to destroy the entire infrastructure. And will we really do better doing that? And what happens when we win? So now it seems to me that they have decided to do something a little bit more targeted. So they're going into particular areas. Presumably there are particular buildings and tunnels and military infrastructure they're going after. Don't get me wrong. They're still, I mean, Gaza it's a brutal strategy with a lot of collateral damage, but it's much, much less than would have happened.
It could also last for much longer.
It will probably last for much longer, so it's tougher on the Israelis. But I think doing something like this that is more targeted, more, more specified, more narrow, is likely ultimately to be a better strategy. They still have the big challenge, Rahul, which is what happens when this all is done.
I'll come to that. Yeah. The mission objective right now is to destroy the Hamas. From what you understand, do you think they'll be able to achieve the objective of finishing the Hamas once and forever?
Look, I think they will be able to deal a very, very lethal blow to Hamas as an organization, as a military operating organization. They did it with Hezbollah, and they were able to. Now Hezbollah is different; it's in its own country, as it were, Lebanon. But they really managed to decimate it. They'll be able to do something similar with Hamas, but they will not be able to change they will not be able to destroy the idea of armed resistance. And that's
the part. Make it worse, in fact.
Right. That's the part which I think fundamentally the Israelis are not thinking through properly, which is, the idea of armed resistance is being fed by the feeling that Palestinians have that nonviolent resistance has gotten them nowhere. The problem for the Israelis is if you don't want armed resistance, you have to demonstrate that nonviolent resistance pays off. And the nonviolent resistance that the Palestinian Authority, in a sense, embodies, which is we'll negotiate with you, we recognize you, we renounce terror, but it's gotten them nothing. They had promised their people a state on the West Bank. They haven't gotten it. They've gotten more checkpoints. They've gotten more military laws. They've even got more violence against them. The settlers have been engaging in random acts of violence. They rarely get arrested or prosecuted. So that's the dilemma. If you say nonviolent protest does not pay, you can understand how people will say, well, maybe violence is the only answer. And as you were implying, this kind of massive assault, Rumsfeld used to have this memo. He say, every day we should ask ourselves, are we killing more terrorists than we are generating with this action? That's a really interesting question to ask in Gaza.
So the initial question was that the Israeli Defense Forces will go in after a few weeks, occupy Gaza, and then the question would be what happens next. Now in this slow and deliberate response, the question changes to what happens in the interim while Gaza is being pounded and the IDF is coming in could take much longer. And secondly, to the point that you said in response to your first answer, who runs Gaza later? I spoke to the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. His sense was it would be an Arab coalition of sorts, an idea he tried to moot many decades ago which didn't work, but he thought it's now more doable than when he was Prime Minister. What's your sense?
I doubt it. Think about this. If you're the President of Egypt, you're the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, are you going to go on the back of Israeli tanks, as it were, after the Israelis have gone in and you know, in a sense, take over from the Israelis, work with the Israelis to set up a government in Gaza? And don't forget, whatever remnants there are of Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not going to be happy with that. They will launch an insurgency against you. The US tried to do this in Iraq. They brought in the UN to help govern Iraq. Immediately, the insurgency targeted the UN, and the that diplomat Sergio de Milo was killed in the bomb blast. So I don't think you're going to be able to find very easily an Arab force that's going to be willing to do this.
So what happens then to Gaza? Who runs it?
My gut is that Israel will face the brutal reality that either it will have to run it or it will have to withdraw, and it will...
But Israel can't possibly run Gaza, given that you have a hostile population. Even if the population comes down from 2 million plus, there's still lakhs of Gazans or Palestinian citizens.
Look, remember, they used to. I mean, Israel occupied Gaza from
and they had to come back.
1967. So, look, maybe I'm wrong, and they will be able to find some coalition of Arab forces that would be willing to do it. But really, those are the three options, right? There's one possibility is you get a bunch of Arab countries to do it. The second is Israel does it. The third is you just leave, and effectively some version of Hamas or something will come together. There is one other thought, which is the Palestinian Authority.
Which is very unpopular. Recent polls shows the Palestinian Authority being very unpopular in Gaza.
Yes. So none of these are optimal outcomes, but could you get the Palestinian Authority to come in again? Would they be willing to come in on the back of Israeli tanks and say we are benefiting from Israel having displaced Hamas? I doubt it. That's the whole problem here is anyone who is coming in, on the backs of Israeli tanks is going to be delegitimized in the eyes of the Gazans, not because they love Hamas, but because they don't like Israel, and they particularly despise what Israel is doing right now. There's this massive military incursion. So how can any force be seen as legitimate that in some way is working hand in glove with the Israeli forces? So if you agree that that's a fundamental problem, then you're left with these two options. Israel rules Gaza, or it leaves and some version of Hamas comes back.
How do you see the Hamas being able to fight back? From the 8th of October to now, to some extent, Hamas's military capacity has been degraded. Your best understanding of how much of their military capacity remains and their ability to hold the IDF back or damage the IDF as it comes in?
My sense is that there's been a lot of damage. The Israelis have dropped a stunning number of bombs in Gaza. I mean, bombs, rockets, whatever you call it. By some accounts, they have already dropped more bombs on Gaza than the US did in Iraq in the first year of the invasion. And, Iraq is a huge country. Gaza is, is a very, very small area. So my sense is there's a lot of damage to the infrastructure. A lot of the tunnels have been damaged. One of the reasons that the Israelis are blocking fuel to Gaza is because that very elaborate system of tunnels that Hamas has built, it's all underground, but it all requires air to be vented in, which is all done through power. And so once you don't have power, those tunnels can become death traps. So I think there's a scenario in which this is not going to be that easy, but urban warfare generally it generally helps the protector, the defender. They know the territory, the Israelis don't. They could have booby-trapped, landmine places. The Israelis don't need it. Interestingly, one of the reasons I think the Israelis did as much aerial bombardment as they did was they don't want to go apartment by apartment. They're just blowing down the entire building. So it's a much more brutal way of doing it. Whereas the United States, when it went into Iraq and helped the Iraqi army clear out cities, they would go apartment by apartment because it was very tough, very hard, very long. The Israelis have just knocked down the entire building.